A racist white nurse gives terrible treatment to a black woman on purpose by dismissing her pain and ignoring her for hours. However, she quickly realizes her grave mistake when the owner of the hospital rushes into the room and calls out for his wife. Camille stirred in her hospital bed, her body weak and heavy with exhaustion. The surgery had taken a toll on her, both physically and emotionally. And waking up in this cold, sterile room only reminded her how vulnerable she was right now. Her eyes flicked open to catch sight of the ceiling lights, harsh and bright. She blinked a few times, trying to focus on her surroundings. The soft sound of shoes squeaking on the polished floor reached her ears, and soon after, the door creaked open. Nurse Shannon Whitfield entered, clipboard in hand, with a glance that was quick and uninterested. Camille caught the look and tried to shift slightly in bed, feeling an uncomfortable ache spread through her body. "How are we feeling today?" Shannon's voice was clipped, devoid of any warmth or concern. Camille swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm managing," she said softly. She felt too tired to explain the discomfort gnawing at her, hoping that Shannon would at least notice her condition and offer some comfort. But Shannon barely glanced her way. "I'll check your vitals," she muttered, more to herself than to Camille, moving to adjust the machines next to the bed. Camille watched her, sensing a coldness in the air. Shannon's movements were mechanical, brisk, and impersonal. She felt more like a task on a checklist than a patient in need of care. The nurse's silence made the room feel even lonelier. Camille wanted to say something, maybe ask for water or just some reassurance, but Shannon's demeanor made her hesitate. "Any pain?" Shannon finally asked, but her tone was more of an afterthought than genuine concern. "Yes," Camille said. "It's a little sharp here." She motioned to her side where the surgery had taken place, hoping for some relief, some sign of empathy. Shannon scribbled something on her clipboard, barely acknowledging Camille's words. "You're on medication, should be managing it well enough," she said curtly. "Just press the button if you need more." Camille let out a small sigh, watching the nurse move around with clinical efficiency, but zero compassion. It felt off. Something in the way Shannon looked at her, in how her words seemed strained, as though she was holding something back. Just as Shannon finished writing notes, the door opened, and Nurse Julia Ramirez popped her head in. "Need anything, Shannon?" Shannon looked over her shoulder and shook her head. "No, just taking care of this one. She's been easy enough." Her voice took on a slight edge when she spoke, her eyes flicking briefly to Camille with a look that felt dismissive. Camille frowned but said nothing. She didn't want to make a fuss. After all, she was still weak, still processing everything. Shannon turned back to Julia and muttered, low enough that she thought Camille wouldn't hear, "You know how it is. Some people just don't know how to take care of themselves. Always end up in situations like this, expecting us to fix everything." Julia didn't respond, just nodded and left the room. Camille's chest tightened. She had heard those words. Every syllable. Some people. Camille lay there, her body aching. But now it wasn't just physical pain. She could feel the sting of those words hanging in the air. Shannon hadn't said it to her face, but the intention was clear. Camille knew exactly what the nurse meant by "some people." Silence stretched between them as Shannon finished up, and Camille bit her lip, trying to suppress the rising frustration. She wanted to say something, to confront Shannon for what she'd said, but the fatigue from the surgery weighed her down. This was a time for healing, not conflict, she reminded herself. After a few more minutes of silence, Shannon left the room, closing the door behind her without so much as a glance back at Camille. As the door clicked shut, the emptiness of the room settled over Camille like a heavy blanket. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She didn't have time to deal with this. She needed Samuel, but the last text she had sent him had gone unanswered. No signal, no contact. He was unreachable, and that left her alone here, with only her thoughts, and Shannon's cutting remarks, for company. Camille closed her eyes, trying to gather herself, but the unease lingered. This was just the beginning. The sun was high outside the window, casting pale light into Camille's hospital room. She lay still, listening to the faint hum of machines as they monitored her vitals. The ache in her side was constant, a dull reminder of the surgery, but the discomfort from Nurse Shannon Whitfield's treatment lingered even more. Shannon entered the room again, this time accompanied by Nurse Julia Ramirez, who was adjusting the IV line. Shannon remained by the door, leaning on the counter with her arms crossed, watching Julia's work with an air of superiority. "How are we today?" Shannon asked, though her voice lacked any real interest. Camille opened her eyes, feeling the weight of the nurse's gaze on her. "I'm okay," she answered, but the words came out quieter than she had intended. Shannon snorted lightly under her breath. "Well, let's keep you comfortable then. I'll be back later." With that, she turned to Julia. Make sure you watch the dosage on that. We don't need anyone getting too dependent on medication. She gave Camille a pointed look as if the comment were aimed directly at her. Julia glanced at Camille apologetically, but remained silent. Camille could sense the younger nurse's discomfort, but she appreciated her gentler touch, especially after Shannon's coldness. Camille remained silent as Shannon left the room, feeling a surge of frustration. It wasn't just the physical discomfort anymore. It was the emotional burden of enduring Shannon's subtle yet biting racism. Every time Shannon came into the room, Camille felt more like an inconvenience than a patient. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Camille alone with Julia. I'm sorry about that, Julia said quietly, breaking the silence. She's just like that with everyone. Camille turned her head slightly, raising an eyebrow. Is she? She asked softly, not wanting to push too hard but unable to hide her curiosity. Julia hesitated, then glanced at the door to ensure it was closed. Not everyone, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But she's been here a long time, and she knows how to get away with things. Camille took a deep breath, the tightness in her chest growing. I've noticed, she said, her voice level but full of meaning. Julia gave her a sympathetic look, her eyes lingering for a moment longer before she returned to adjusting Camille's IV line. Camille appreciated her kindness, but it didn't change the fact that Shannon was in charge. As the day went on, Shannon's behavior only worsened. She delayed bringing medication, claiming she was too busy, and made no effort to hide her disdain whenever she entered the room. Camille overheard snippets of conversations outside the door, always the same tone, the same bitterness. Patients like her, always demanding, Shannon had muttered to Julia earlier in the day. No respect for what we have to deal with here. Just want everything handed to them. Camille's hand gripped the edge of her blanket, her frustration mounting. She had never once asked for special treatment. She only wanted what any patient would expect: decent care, compassion, and respect. But Shannon's words dripped with racism, the subtle kind that many tried to hide but couldn't fully suppress. Camille had heard it before, too many times in her life. But what could she do? She was recovering, her body weak, her husband unreachable. The one person who could intervene, the person who owned the very hospital she was lying in, wasn't there. The irony stung her as much as Shannon's words. She could do nothing but endure, waiting for Samuel to return. By the third day, Camille felt isolated, not just by the walls of the hospital, but by the silence that surrounded her. No calls from Samuel, no updates from the outside world. She tried texting him again, but every message went unanswered. Each time, her hope that he would swoop in and fix the situation dimmed a little more. Shannon's visits grew shorter and more dismissive, as if Camille wasn't even worth her time. Camille would ask for pain medication, only for Shannon to sigh and say, I'll get to it when I can, before walking out. Camille pressed the button to call for help, feeling a twinge of pain flare in her side. A different nurse, someone she hadn't met yet, entered the room and brought her the medication. It was a small relief, but the thought of Shannon being in charge of her care still loomed over her like a cloud. Later, as Camille lay there trying to rest, she overheard another conversation outside her door. Shannon's voice was sharp, as usual. I don't know why we have to bend over backward for patients like that. They should be grateful they're even in here. Julia's voice was softer, hesitant. I don't think she's been demanding at all, Shannon snorted. You don't understand. People like her think they deserve the world handed to them. They expect us to bow down, and for what? Just because they managed to find a bed here? Camille's stomach churned with anger. This time, Shannon's words cut deeper. She wasn't just dismissing Camille as a patient. She was reducing her entire existence to a stereotype, one based solely on the color of her skin. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone again, sending another message to Samuel. Please come. I need you. No reply. The isolation was suffocating. Camille lay back, closing her eyes and taking deep breaths. She was strong, but even strength had limits. How long could she endure this? How long would she be forced to listen to Shannon's veiled racism while being helpless to fight back? Her mind wandered to Samuel. She needed him here, needed him to help her stand up against this. But until he returned, she had to bide her time, trapped in a place where she should have felt safe, but now only felt small. The next morning, Camille awoke to the sound of the door creaking open. She squinted, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the blinds. Nurse Shannon Whitfield stood at the entrance, clipboard in hand, her expression more sour than ever. Good morning, Shannon said, her voice flat. I'll be handling all your care today. Camille's heart sank. Shannon had taken over completely. No more Julia, no more quiet kindness from the younger nurse. It was just her and Shannon now. and Camille felt the weight of that reality settle over her like a thick, heavy blanket. Shannon moved around the room with the same cold efficiency as before, her eyes never meeting Camille's. She checked the machines, scribbled some notes, and mumbled something under her breath that Camille couldn't quite catch. The tension was unbearable, and Camille had had enough. Her patience had worn thin, her strength slowly returning with each passing day. But so had her frustration. She could no longer endure the quiet insults and neglect, not when Shannon had made her feel like an afterthought, like less than a person. As Shannon moved toward the door to leave, Camille's voice cut through the silence. "Shannon," Camille said, her tone steady but laced with anger. Shannon stopped, her hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "Yes?" she said with that same dismissive air. Camille took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I need to talk to you about the way you've been treating me." Shannon's back stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "What about it?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "You've been dismissive, rude, and neglectful," Camille said, her words coming out sharper than she expected. "I've overheard the things you've said about me. I know what you think of me." Shannon finally turned, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Camille. "And what exactly do you think you overheard?" Camille's chest tightened, but she pushed through. "I heard you talking about me like I'm less than human, like I don't deserve proper care. I've heard the racist things you've said." Shannon's face twitched with annoyance, but she gave a thin, humorless smile. "I don't know what you think you heard, but I'm just doing my job. You're a patient, and I'm your nurse. That's all there is to it." Camille felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. She couldn't hold back any longer. "This is unacceptable. I don't deserve to be treated like this, especially in my own hospital." Shannon raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting to one of smug disbelief. "Your hospital?" "Yes," Camille said, her voice growing firmer. "My husband owns this hospital, Dr. Samuel Jameson. He's the one who built this place, and you're going to regret treating me like this when he finds out." Shannon blinked, and for a brief moment, Camille thought she saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a sneer. "Oh, sure," Shannon said with a chuckle. "Your husband owns the hospital? That's rich." She folded her arms across her chest, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but patients like you always pull this card. You think name-dropping some big shot is going to scare me into giving you special treatment?" Camille's hands gripped the edges of her blanket, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "This isn't about special treatment. It's about basic respect and professionalism. I've been nothing but polite, and you've treated me like I'm beneath you." Shannon took a step closer to the bed, her smile fading into a hard line. "I've worked here for over 20 years, and I've seen all kinds of patients come through these doors. You're no different from the rest of them. Entitled, always expecting more than you deserve." Camille's mouth went dry, the words hitting her like a slap. "I deserve to be treated with dignity, just like anyone else." Shannon leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper, full of venom. "You can say whatever you want, but we both know the truth, don't we? People like you always think they can demand whatever they want and get away with it." Camille's breath caught in her throat, the words cutting deep. She had tried to reason with Shannon, to confront her with dignity, but it was clear the nurse had no intention of changing her behavior. Shannon didn't believe her, didn't care who her husband was. Shannon straightened up, turning to leave. "I'll be back later with your medication," she said over her shoulder. "If you behave." Camille's heart raced as Shannon walked out, the door closing with a soft click. She lay there, her mind spinning, her anger bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every patient Shannon had mistreated, every cruel word she had spoken behind closed doors. Camille grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she texted Samuel once more. "Please come. I need you here. I can't take this anymore." No reply. The silence was deafening. Camille stared at the door, her mind racing. She had confronted Shannon, told her the truth, and the nurse had dismissed her, mocked her even. But Camille wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Samuel would return, and when he did, Shannon would regret ever underestimating her. The room felt colder than usual, the sterile air suffocating as Camille lay motionless in her bed. Hours passed since her confrontation with Shannon, but the anger and frustration refused to subside. Every part of her ached, not just from the surgery, but from the weight of the mistreatment she had been enduring. The door creaked open again, and Shannon strolled in, a smirk playing on her lips, as if she'd won some invisible battle. Camille watched her carefully, her body tensing in anticipation of whatever Shannon might say next. "Well, well," Shannon said with mock cheeriness, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "How's the owner's wife doing today?" She emphasized the words with an exaggerated tone, clearly enjoying her little performance. Camille didn't respond, biting her lip to hold back her frustration. She wasn't in the mood for Shannon's games, but she knew it was inevitable. The nurse's attitude had only gotten worse after their last conversation, and Camille could sense that Shannon was testing her, trying to push her to her breaking point. Shannon took a few slow, deliberate steps toward the bed, her eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "You know," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial, "I was thinking about what you said earlier, that your husband owns this hospital. Isn't that something? You must think you're pretty important, huh?" Camille's jaw clenched, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as Shannon continued to circle the bed like a predator toying with its prey. "I mean," Shannon went on, "I've heard a lot of patients make up stories in my time here, but this one's a real gem. My husband owns the hospital." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound that filled the room. "Do you really think I'm that stupid?" Camille took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket. She wasn't going to let Shannon see how much her words stung, how much they cut into her like a knife. But it was getting harder to keep her composure, especially when she felt so alone, so powerless. Shannon leaned over, her face hovering just above Camille's. "You know what I think?" she whispered, her breath hot against Camille's skin. "I think you're just like the rest of them, always trying to act like you're better than everyone else, like you deserve special treatment. But guess what? You're not special. Not to me. Not to anyone." Camille's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand that Shannon stop, but she swallowed her words, refusing to let the nurse see how deeply she was affected. Shannon stood up straight, smiling smugly. "And let's be real. If your husband really did own this place, wouldn't he be here by now? Wouldn't he have swooped in to save his precious wife?" She chuckled again, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "Face it, honey. You're just another patient, another nobody." Camille's breath hitched, her chest tight with anger. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, couldn't believe how far Shannon was willing to push her. But as much as she wanted to lash out, she knew that wouldn't solve anything. She had to stay calm, to stay composed, even if it felt impossible. Shannon's eyes glinted with amusement as she turned to leave. "I'll be back later, Mrs. Jameson," she said mockingly, her tone filled with derision. "Don't you worry. I'll make sure you get all the attention you deserve." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Camille alone in the suffocating silence once again. Her chest heaved with the effort of holding back tears, her fingers trembling as she clutched her phone. She typed another message to Samuel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely form the words. "Please, hurry. I can't take this anymore." Her eyes burned with unshed tears as she hit send, staring at the empty room around her. Shannon's words echoed in her mind, her mocking voice replaying over and over like a cruel taunt. But Camille wasn't going to let her win. She wasn't going to let Shannon's cruelty break her. Samuel would come. He had to. And when he did, Shannon would finally understand just who she had been mocking all this time. Camille lay there, staring at the ceiling, her breath shallow as her anger mixed with exhaustion. She couldn't take Shannon's cruelty any longer. It felt like the walls of the hospital were closing in on her, suffocating her, making her feel smaller with each snide comment, each moment of neglect. The pain in her side had returned, a throbbing ache that pulsed with every beat of her heart. She pressed the call button by her bed, but it had been over 20 minutes and no one had come. No Shannon, no Julia, no one. Frustration bubbled up inside her. She couldn't stay there, trapped, waiting for Shannon to return with another round of insults. She needed help. Someone, anyone who could take over her care. Someone who would treat her like a human being. Camille glanced at the door, her heart racing with the thought of leaving the bed. She had barely moved since the surgery, her body still weak, but she couldn't wait any longer. She had to find someone who would listen, someone who would see her. With a grunt of effort, Camille swung her legs over the side of the bed. The sudden movement sent a wave of dizziness through her, but she gritted her teeth and pushed herself up, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress for support. Her body screamed in protest, every muscle tensing from the strain. But she wouldn't let herself fall back into that bed, not while Shannon still controlled her care. Slowly, shakily, she rose to her feet. The room spun around her, and her vision blurred for a moment, but she stayed upright. Her breathing labored as she fought against the weakness pulling her back down. Camille took a tentative step toward the door, her body swaying as she moved. Just a few more steps, she thought. Just a few more steps, and she could get someone, anyone, who could take over. She would even take a janitor at this point. But before she could reach the door, it swung open violently, and there stood Shannon, her expression hard and cold as ever. Her eyes scanned Camille with a mix of surprise and disgust. "And just where do you think you're going?" Shannon's voice was icy, her hand still on the door handle. Camille froze, her legs trembling under her weight. Her body felt like it was on the verge of collapsing, but she forced herself to stand tall, even as the dizziness threatened to overwhelm her. I need someone else," Camille said, her voice wavering but determined. "I can't take this anymore." Shannon stepped into the room, her eyes narrowing as she approached. "Get back in bed," she ordered, her tone sharp and uncompromising. "No," Camille said, her voice firmer this time. "I'm not staying here under your care. You've been nothing but—" She cut herself off, her breath ragged as she struggled to stay standing. Shannon crossed her arms, her expression shifting from irritation to something more dangerous. "Oh, you think you can just walk out of here and demand someone else, huh?" "I don't think so, sweetheart. You're too weak to make it 5 steps without collapsing." Camille's legs trembled, the room spinning around her, but she refused to back down. "I'll find someone who'll actually help me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Shannon stepped closer, towering over Camille as she faltered on her feet. "You're not going anywhere," she said darkly, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You can barely stand, and you think you're going to just walk out and find someone else? You're staying right here under my care whether you like it or not." Shannon's hand shot out, gripping Camille's arm roughly and pulling her back toward the bed. Camille gasped, her body weak and helpless as Shannon forced her to sit down. "Sit down!" Shannon snarled, her grip tightening. "You're not going to make a scene. Not here. I'm the nurse in charge, and you don't get to pick and choose who takes care of you." Camille winced at the strength of Shannon's grip, pain radiating through her arm as she was shoved back onto the bed. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and fury rising inside her. "I don't care who your husband is, or what kind of story you've cooked up," Shannon continued, her voice dripping with malice. "You're going to stay in this bed, and you're going to listen to me. Got it?" Camille's eyes filled with tears of frustration, her body too weak to resist. She had never felt so powerless, so trapped. She had been strong for so long, enduring Shannon's insults, the cruel jabs, the neglect. But now, with Shannon towering over her, Camille felt the weight of helplessness pressed down on her, like a vice. "Now, lie back down before you hurt yourself," Shannon said, her voice softening slightly but still filled with venom. She released Camille's arm and stepped back, watching as Camille slowly lowered herself onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion and defeat. Camille closed her eyes, the tears threatening to spill over. She had tried. She had tried to stand up for herself, but her body had failed her. And now Shannon stood victorious, a smug smile curling at the corner of her mouth. "I'll bring your medication soon," Shannon said coldly. "And next time, don't even think about trying to pull a stunt like this again." The door closed with a loud thud, leaving Camille lying there, her body weak and her spirit crushed. She felt trapped in that bed, powerless to escape Shannon's cruelty. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, and with shaky hands she reached for it, praying that it was Samuel. She unlocked the screen, her heart pounding as she read the message. No service. The words blurred in front of her as the tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Samuel was still out of reach, still unaware of what was happening to her. Camille lay back against the pillow, her heart heavy with despair. She couldn't move. She couldn't fight back. All she could do was wait. But deep down, she knew that when Samuel finally returned, Shannon would regret every single thing she had done. Camille lay still in her hospital bed, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Every muscle in her body ached, not just from the surgery, but from the emotional toll of enduring Shannon's cruelty. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the steady hum of machines beeping softly beside her. She stared blankly at the ceiling, feeling the hopelessness creeping in again. The door creaked open, and Camille's heart skipped a beat. She braced herself for another round of Shannon's mockery, her body tensing involuntarily. But when she turned her head, she was met not with Shannon's cold, sneering face, but the familiar, gentle presence of Nurse Julia Ramirez. "Julia," Camille whispered, her voice shaky with surprise and relief. Julia hadn't been in her room for days, and her absence had made everything worse. Julia gave Camille a soft smile as she stepped in, closing the door quietly behind her. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Jameson," she said, her voice filled with genuine remorse. I didn't know who you were until today." Camille blinked, confusion and exhaustion clouding her thoughts. "What do you mean?" Julia pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, her eyes filled with concern. "I overheard some of the other nurses talking," she explained. "I heard them mention that you're the wife of Dr. Samuel Jameson, the owner of the hospital, I had no idea. Camille's breath caught in her throat. You found out? Julia nodded, her face apologetic. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Jameson. If I'd known, I would have done something sooner. But Shannon, she made sure I was reassigned to another floor. I didn't have any idea what was really going on. Camille's heart tightened with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Shannon. She reassigned you? Julia's expression darkened slightly, her voice lowering as she continued. Yes. Right after you came out of surgery. I didn't even get a chance to check in on you after the first day because Shannon told the shift manager that she'd take over all your care. She made it sound like you were in good hands, and I didn't question it. I should have known something was off, but Camille swallowed hard, her emotions swirling. It all made sense now. Shannon had made sure she was the only one in control of Camille's care, ensuring no one else could witness or stop her abuse. The thought made Camille's stomach churn. I heard some of what she said to you, Julia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She's been awful, hasn't she? Camille nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears she had tried to hold back for days. She's been cruel, dismissive, racist, and she doesn't believe who I am. She thinks I'm making it up about my husband. Julia reached out and gently squeezed Camille's hand. She can't get away with this, Mrs. Jameson. I've already contacted someone, one of the administrators, and they were able to get in touch with your husband. He's on his way back right now. Camille felt her heart leap with a mixture of relief and disbelief. You reached him? Julia nodded. I did. One of the other nurses overheard Shannon talking about you. And when I found out the truth, I couldn't let it go. I made sure to get someone who could reach him. He should be here soon. Tears welled up in Camille's eyes again, but this time, they weren't just from frustration or anger. They were from a deep sense of relief. Samuel was coming. He knew. After days of feeling helpless, she finally had hope that things would change. Julia hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer, her voice serious. You need to know something else, though, she said carefully. Shannon knows now. She knows you're his wife, and she's still been treating you like this. I'm so sorry for what she's done to you. Camille's chest tightened as Julia's words sank in. Shannon knew who she was, and even knowing that, she had continued to mock and mistreat her. Camille's mind reeled at the audacity of it. I'll make sure she never gets near you again, Julia added, her voice firm. She's been reassigned for the rest of her shift. The administration is aware of what's been happening, and they're going to deal with it once your husband gets here. Camille exhaled slowly, the relief washing over her in waves. It was finally happening. After days of enduring Shannon's abuse, someone was stepping in. Samuel was coming. Shannon would face the consequences of her actions. But despite the relief, a lingering anger remained, simmering beneath the surface. Shannon had tormented her for days, dismissing her, mocking her, making her feel like she was nothing. And now, knowing full well who Camille was, she had continued her cruelty, seemingly fearless of the consequences. Thank you, Julia, Camille whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't think I could take much more. Julia smiled softly, her eyes full of understanding. You don't have to go through this alone anymore. Your husband will be here soon, and I'll make sure everything is handled. You'll be out of here and back on your feet in no time. Camille nodded, but her mind was already spinning with what was to come. When Samuel arrived, Shannon would finally face the truth. And this time, there would be no escaping the consequences of her actions. As Julia left the room to handle more arrangements, Camille lay back in bed, her heart racing with anticipation. It wouldn't be long now. Samuel would walk through that door, and Shannon's reign of cruelty would end. But even more than that, Camille would have her chance to finally speak her truth. Camille's heart raced as the door to her hospital room swung open, and there stood Samuel, his tall frame brimming with an intensity she hadn't seen in a long time. His eyes softened the moment they landed on her, but beneath that tenderness, there was a barely restrained fury simmering just beneath the surface. Camille, he breathed, crossing the room in swift, determined strides. He knelt by her bedside, taking her hand in his. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what you were going through. Tears welled up in Camille's eyes as she reached for him, feeling the weight of days of isolation and cruelty begin to lift. Samuel, she whispered, her voice hoarse. It's been awful. I tried to contact you, but I couldn't get through. I've been trapped here with that nurse, Shannon. Samuel's grip on her hand tightened. I know, he said, his jaw clenched. Julia told me everything. I can't believe this happened in my hospital. Camille took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she began to recount the torment she had endured. She's been horrible to me, dismissive, condescending. The things she said to me, Samuel. She mocked me, She didn't believe me when I told her I was your wife. She acted like I was nothing, like I didn't deserve proper care, and when she realized who I was, she still treated me like I was beneath her. Samuel's face darkened with anger, his eyes blazing with rage. What exactly did she say? I need to know everything. Camille nodded, her voice steadying as she recounted the moments of Shannon's cruelty. She would talk down to me, refuse to help me when I was in pain, and then make comments about how people like me were always demanding more than we deserved. She would tell me that I was lucky to even be here, and when I tried to confront her, when I told her you were my husband, she laughed in my face. She said I was lying, that I was just another patient trying to get special treatment. Samuel stood up abruptly, pacing the small room, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath, his voice low and dangerous. She's been treating my wife like this? In the very hospital I built? Camille watched him, her heart aching at the sight of his frustration. She could see how much it hurt him to know that this had happened while he was away, powerless to help her. She's still assigned to me, Camille added quietly, feeling a surge of anger rise in her chest. I was too weak to do anything, Samuel. I tried to stand up, to get someone else, but I couldn't. She pushed me back into the bed, told me I wasn't going anywhere. Samuel stopped pacing and turned toward the door, his expression hardening. She's still here, isn't she? Camille nodded, her stomach twisting with both anticipation and dread. She doesn't know you're here yet. Samuel's eyes narrowed. Well, she's about to find out. He stormed toward the door, opening it with such force that it slammed against the wall. Julia! He called out, his voice echoing through the hallway. Bring Shannon here. Now, a few minutes passed in tense silence before the door opened again, and there she was, Nurse Shannon Whitfield, her expression as smug as ever. But that smugness faltered the moment she saw Samuel standing there, his face etched with fury. Dr. Jameson, Shannon said, trying to maintain her professional facade. I didn't know you were back. Samuel's eyes flashed with anger. I'm back, Shannon, and I've heard some very disturbing things about how you've been treating my wife. Shannon's face went pale. Your wife? She glanced at Camille, her eyes wide with disbelief. Wait, her? That's right, Samuel said, his voice cold and cutting. Her. Camille is my wife, and you've been mistreating her from the moment she arrived. Shannon's mouth opened and closed as she scrambled to find words. I didn't know, she stammered. I had no idea. Oh, you knew, Samuel snapped, cutting her off. She told you, didn't she? And you didn't believe her. Instead, you mocked her, you insulted her, and you neglected her care. Am I wrong? Shannon's face flushed with panic, but she still tried to regain her composure. I didn't mean any harm, Dr. Jameson. I was just following protocol. Protocol? Samuel barked, stepping closer to her, his voice rising with anger. Is protocol what made you dismiss her pain? Was protocol what made you call her entitled? Is protocol the reason you shoved her back into bed when she tried to get help? Is that your excuse for racism? Shannon took a step back, visibly shaken. I didn't, she began. But Samuel wasn't finished. You've been here for over 20 years, Shannon. You're supposed to be one of the most experienced nurses in this hospital. But instead of showing compassion, instead of doing your job, you've been mistreating patients, haven't you? Especially patients who look like my wife. Shannon's eyes darted around the room, her breath quickening as she realized there was no escape. I didn't know. You knew, Samuel said coldly. You knew exactly what you were doing. For a moment, the room was thick with silence. Shannon stood frozen, her face flushed with fear and shame, while Samuel glared at her, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled rage. Camille watched from her bed, feeling both empowered and exhausted by the confrontation. Finally, Samuel's voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper. You will leave this hospital immediately. You're going home for the day, and you will return tomorrow for a meeting with the administration. Trust me, Shannon. You will answer for what you've done. Shannon's face went white as she realized what was happening. Dr. Jameson, please, she began, her voice trembling. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean, get out, Samuel said sharply, his voice final. Go home, now. Shannon stood there for a moment, stunned, before she finally turned and left the room. Her footsteps hurried and unsteady as she disappeared down the hallway. Samuel let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his anger. He turned back to Camille, his expression softening as he returned to her side. She's gone, he said quietly, his hand resting gently on hers. But tomorrow, she'll face the consequences. I promise you that. Camille exhaled, the tension slowly easing from her body. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I needed you here. Samuel leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I'm here now, and I'll make sure this never happens again. They sat together in the quiet room, the storm finally starting to settle. But Camille knew there was still more to come. Tomorrow, Shannon would return for the meeting, and this time, Camille would be there to ensure that every one of her actions was brought to light, and she would make sure that Shannon never hurt anyone like this again. The next morning, Camille sat in her hospital room, dressed and ready to leave. But there was one final thing to do before she could walk out of this place. Today, she wasn't just leaving as a patient recovering from surgery. She was leaving as a woman who had faced injustice and was ready to demand accountability. Samuel stood by her side, his expression serious but calm. He had arranged for the meeting with Shannon and the hospital administration. This would be the moment when everything Shannon had done would be laid out for all to see. You ready? Samuel asked, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. Camille nodded, feeling the weight of the past few days lift slightly. I am. It's time. Together, they made their way to the meeting room. Camille felt the stares of the staff as she walked down the hallway with Samuel. And though part of her still felt weak from the physical toll of her surgery, her heart was steady. She wasn't afraid anymore. When they entered the meeting room, Shannon was already there, seated at the long conference table, looking nervous and unsure. Her usual smugness was gone, replaced by a look of dread as she realized the gravity of her situation. The hospital's head administrator, a composed woman named Dr. Morrison, sat across from her, flipping through papers. Julia was also in the room, sitting quietly on the side, ready to provide any additional testimony if needed. Camille and Samuel took their seats across from Shannon. For a moment, the room was filled with tense silence, the air thick with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Thank you all for being here, Dr. Morrison began, her voice professional and neutral. We are here today to address the serious allegations regarding Nurse Shannon Whitfield's treatment of Mrs. Camille Jameson during her stay at this hospital. Camille, would you like to begin? Camille took a deep breath and glanced at Samuel, who gave her a reassuring nod. She turned her attention to Shannon, who was visibly fidgeting, her hands nervously clasped in her lap. Camille's voice was steady as she spoke. I want to tell you all what happened while I was here, Camille began, her tone calm but laced with emotion. I was admitted after emergency surgery, and from the moment Nurse Shannon was assigned to me, things went wrong. She was cold, dismissive, and made it very clear that she didn't think I was worth her time or care. Shannon's eyes darted to Dr. Morrison, as if looking for some kind of escape, but there was none. Camille continued. I overheard her making racist comments about me to other staff members, Camille said, her voice growing firmer. Things like how people like me are always demanding more than we deserve. She called me entitled, acted like I was a burden, and when I told her who my husband was, she laughed in my face. She shoved me back into bed when I tried to leave, saying I didn't deserve the care I was asking for. Camille's chest tightened as she recounted the moments of cruelty, the weight of those experiences finally being lifted off her shoulders as she got it all out. I lay in that bed helpless while she mocked me, neglected me, and treated me as if I didn't matter. And it wasn't just about who I was married to. She treated me like this because I'm a black woman. That much was clear from the way she spoke, from the things she said about me when she thought I wasn't listening. The room was silent, all eyes on Camille as she let the truth spill out. Shannon was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't interrupt. There was nothing she could say to defend herself now. Samuel leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet rage. This is my wife we're talking about, Shannon. The fact that you knew who she was, or should have known, didn't change how you treated her. You didn't see her as a person. You saw her as someone beneath you, someone you could mistreat without consequences. Shannon swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. I didn't mean, Camille cut her off, her voice rising with the pain she'd held inside. You did mean it, Shannon. You didn't care about me. You didn't care that I was in pain, that I was afraid. You didn't care about the color of my skin. And you didn't care that I deserved respect, just like anyone else. You saw me as less than human, and that's what hurts the most. Shannon's eyes filled with tears, but Camille didn't soften. This wasn't about pity. This was about closure. Camille had spent days feeling powerless, but now, with Samuel by her side and the truth finally out in the open, she felt her strength returning. You had every opportunity to treat me with dignity, Camille continued, her voice calm but firm, but you chose not to, and now you have to face the consequences of your actions. Dr. Morrison cleared her throat, her face solemn as she addressed Shannon directly. Nurse Whitfield, the allegations against you are serious and disturbing. This kind of behavior has no place in this hospital, or any hospital for that matter. We will be conducting a full investigation, but based on the testimony we've heard today, it's clear that your actions were unacceptable. Shannon lowered her head, her face flushed with shame. I'm sorry, she muttered, though the words felt hollow. Camille took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those two words settle over her. It wasn't enough. Nothing Shannon could say would undo what had happened. But hearing those words, even if they were insincere, felt like the final step toward closure. Dr. Morrison sighed. For now, you are being sent home and placed on immediate leave. You will not return to this hospital until the investigation is complete. And from what I've seen today, I expect this will result in your termination. Shannon stood up slowly, her face pale as she gathered her things. She didn't look at Camille or Samuel as she shuffled out of the room, her head hanging low. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed felt like a weight being lifted from Camille's chest. Camille sat back in her chair, letting out a long, slow breath. It was over. The confrontation, the lies, the cruelty, it was all behind her now. She had said everything she needed to say, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. Samuel reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. You did it, he said softly. Camille nodded, her heart swelling with relief. We did it. Dr. Morrison stood, her face serious but kind. Mrs. Jameson, I'm deeply sorry for what you've been through. This hospital will not tolerate this kind of behavior, and I assure you, Shannon Whitfield will be held accountable. Camille nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Thank you. I hope no one else has to go through what I did. As they left the room, walking down the quiet hallway together, Camille felt lighter than she had in days. The nightmare was over, and she was finally free from Shannon's cruelty. Samuel wrapped his arm around her as they stepped into the sunlight outside the hospital. We're going home, he said, his voice gentle and filled with love. Camille leaned against him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Home, she whispered, finally at peace. A week had passed since Camille returned home, and she lay comfortably in bed, propped up by pillows, her body finally starting to heal. The gentle light filtering through the curtains bathed the room in a soothing glow, a welcome contrast to the sterile, cold atmosphere of the hospital. She was still recovering physically, but emotionally she was in a much better place. Samuel had made sure of that. Today, though, there was something different in the way Samuel entered the room. He carried a tray with her breakfast, but the look in his eyes told her there was more on his mind than just bringing her food. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed, taking her hand gently. You seem unusually happy this morning, Camille remarked with a soft smile. Samuel chuckled, the corners of his eyes crinkling as he returned her smile. I am, he said. I've got some good news, and I think you'll want to hear it. Camille leaned back against the pillows, her curiosity piqued. Tell me. Samuel took a deep breath, his expression serious, but satisfied. It's done, Camille. Shannon has been officially fired. Camille exhaled, the words lifting a weight from her chest that she hadn't realized was still there. So it's over, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel nodded. It's over. The investigation was thorough. We made sure every detail was accounted for. Every witness statement was documented. I didn't want to leave any room for her to claim wrongful termination or try to sue the hospital. Camille's brows furrowed slightly. Did you really think she'd try to sue? Samuel's expression grew more serious. People like her, when they feel cornered, they sometimes lash out any way they can. I wasn't going to take any chances, especially not when it came to protecting you and the hospital's reputation. We made sure everything was airtight. There's no way she can come back from this. No legal loopholes she can use. She's gone for good. Camille felt a sense of relief, knowing that Samuel had taken every precaution to ensure that Shannon couldn't fight her dismissal. She had worried in the back of her mind that Shannon might find a way to twist the situation and somehow make herself the victim. But now, that fear was gone. I'm glad, Camille said softly, her voice steady. She deserved to be held accountable. She did, Samuel agreed, his voice firm. And we made sure she was. The hospital's administration backed the decision, and all the evidence was in your favor. There's no room for her to dispute it. Camille closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to savor the sense of justice. After everything Shannon had put her through, the cruelty, the mockery, the neglect, there was something deeply satisfying in knowing that she wouldn't get away with it. But Samuel wasn't done. His expression softened as he leaned closer. There's more. Camille opened her eyes, curious. More? Samuel's smile returned, this time filled with pride. Julia, she's been promoted. After everything she did to help you and the way she stepped in during all of this, the administration recognized her value. She's now the head nurse of her department. Camille's heart swelled with warmth. Julia? That's wonderful. She really deserves it. She does, Samuel said, nodding. She went out of her way to make sure you were safe, even when she didn't have to. She's the kind of nurse we need in the hospital. And I made sure the administration knew that. Camille smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Julia had been a beacon of kindness in what had otherwise been a dark and painful experience. Knowing that she had been rewarded for her compassion brought Camille a sense of closure. I'm so happy for her, Camille said softly. She made such a difference. She'll be by to visit soon, Samuel added. Once you're feeling stronger. Camille nodded, the weight of the last few weeks finally lifting completely. The nightmare was over. Shannon was gone, and the hospital had taken the steps to ensure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to anyone else. Justice had been served, and the people who had supported her, like Julia, were being rewarded. Thank you, Camille said, her voice filled with emotion, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. Samuel leaned in and kissed her forehead gently. You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I could be here for you. Camille closed her eyes, letting herself rest, knowing that for the first time in a long while, she could truly begin to heal. The nightmare was behind her, and with Samuel by her side, she knew she would be able to move forward. As Samuel sat beside her, holding her hand, Camille felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Justice had been done, and the people who mattered had been recognized. Now, it was time to rest.